Anyway, I'm glad you're back this morning as good, predictable Baptists. Everybody's in the same spot they were in last night, it looks like. And, I see you, Brother Juan, I see you right there. I got to meet and talk to your two kids last night. I am very impressed with your kids. So, okay, you should be proud, and it's obvious they take after their mother. So I'll just leave it at that, All right. And just a word, a favor you can do me. I appreciate so much the convention buying enough copies of the two books I've written for you to have those free. As you read if you read those, let me say it that way, and if you enjoy them, and if you don't, go to Amazon and do a review, because that just kind of, the way all that stuff works, the more reviews there are, the more they come to the top. And if it's a critical review, put it on there. That's fine. Just be nice, okay? Be truthful. But that would help if you would do that also. Well, last night we talked about the map. Who changed the map? What has kind of happened historically and philosophically to get us to where we are now. Now in session 2, we're going to talk about reading the map, and this is kind of that Issachar principle. We need to not only understand the times, we need to know what to do, and we're going to be moving more and more in the next 3 sessions to what to do. Now, if you've flown on a commercial plane, you probably at least every now and then have flown through or near or around stormy weather. At least you've probably had your flight delayed or canceled at some point due to bad weather, and 70% of flight cancellations are due to weather issues. Now, the statistics, you've probably heard the statistics say flying is safer than driving, even when there is bad weather. Now, some of you are like my wife, don't bother me with the facts. I'm still scared, I still don't want to be on that plane, but she'll do it. She wants to go places, she just doesn't like getting there. But still, bad weather can be dangerous, certainly can cause discomfort, so pilots are going to do whatever they can to avoid it. Consider some of the things airline pilots or any pilot has to take into account. Wind, more than rain, you're talking about bad weather, directly affects the flight of an airplane because the lifts, that created by the movement of the air over the wings. And so any kind of shift in air pressure, wind speed, wind direction can cause that plane to just rise or drop suddenly. Don't you like it when it just does that kind of thing? Yeah. Now, planes get struck by lightning every now and then. That sounds weird, but, they're built to sustain the impact, happens all the time. Serious accidents due to lightning strikes are rare. The most risky weather patterns involve the thunderstorms that bring heavy rain, hail, icing, those strong downdrafts that we saw last night as an example. But you'll be glad to know that taking off in a downpour is really no big deal for planes. Large ground fires, they cause updrafts, downdrafts. They bring all this extra turbulence. Icing in winter, low visibility. There's even the occasional tornado that a plane has to deal with. So flying a plane requires knowing about weather, about possible storms, about staying up on what may be approaching. Flying requires that you know how to read the map and make appropriate adjustments. Well, what about your church, the community where you serve? Do you really know the people you're trying to reach? Do you really understand how they think? Do you know what they fear, what they desire, what they hope for, what they live for? Do you understand their culture, their worldview? Do you understand the rapidly changing culture as we talk about the world in America, in New Mexico, right down to where you serve? Once you do, will you be able to design a new flight plan for ministry, for mission? Do you know how? Well, the map of our country has changed. Can you read it? Now, I realize I'm talking to many church planters here, and as a church planter, you've learned how to do this. This is what you do. But sometimes, even though you're a church planting or you're revitalizing and you know these things, we don't, I'm not going to tell you anything different here, anything really new, but we need to be reminded of some things. And we also need to be reminded that sometimes we make lots of assumptions. Our people don't always know that. When I say our people in the community you're trying to reach, and if you're an established church, you know that they are many times not aware of what's happening. Well, let's define a few terms here first. that whole term culture, that gets thrown around a lot, and there's all kinds of definitions, for many Christians, for some Christians, the word often carries mostly negative connotation. I mean, we want to be countercultural, or we don't want to sell out to the culture. And by the way, if you're in a culture, you've already sold out to it to some degree or another, but, we never see it in us, always see it in you, Well, all that's true, but what is culture? Culture is simply who we are. It embraces all of life. It involves worldview, it involves ways of thinking, language, and our behavioral patterns, the way we communicate, social structures, our institutions. Culture is the social environments in which we're born, in which we're reared, where we live, where we learn. And a culture can be broad. I mean, it can be as broad as Western culture or American culture. Or it can be as narrow as second-generation Hispanic New Mexican border culture. I mean, we can take it as broad or as narrow as we need to. So, is culture good or bad? And the answer is yes. The challenge is to let Scripture, to let the Bible evaluate all of culture, including my culture. and let Scripture determine what needs to be changed, what needs to be challenged, what is really kind of neutral. It's just part of who you are. And what's acceptable. The problem is that I see the negative in your culture a whole lot easier than I see the negative in my culture. We experience that all the time. So that's culture. Now, what about worldview? A worldview is simply the lenses through which we see, we understand, we interpret the world. And obviously, worldview and culture are closely related because one's culture or cultures, because we could be multicultural in a sense, they shape, they form, they influence our worldview. And so culture and worldview can't be separated. Whereas culture is kind of the external, in that it is the house we live in, our worldview is internal. It's the processing systems that are shaped by that culture. The challenge for us, of course, is to move, to be shaped more and more by biblical worldview in spite of our culture, whether it's good or bad. Now, I want to talk about a few American changes that are affecting culture and worldview, and there are many changes, but I want to just talk about some of the major changes that are happening in American society. And again, none of this is really new to you, but maybe there's some new way of looking at this or some new information here that we need to look at. Now, number one is, of course, growing diversity. And if you're in missions at all, if you're church plant, you know this, wherever you are. Now, from the beginning of time, and this is sometimes what some of your folks need to hear, from the beginning of time, peoples have moved and migrated. It's just part of who we are. The Bible itself is full of people movements. The present global reality is no different. Migration is a global phenomenon. I mean, there's that person in your church who thinks everybody's coming to America, and to a degree a lot are. But migration and immigration and illegal immigration is a global issue. Wherever you have a country that's doing better than a neighboring country, there's all kinds of shifting back and forth. Like I told you, I grew up in Chile, and my brother and sister-in-law just came from there, and they have an issue there. And now there are Peruvian neighborhoods and Colombian neighborhoods, and people are coming from other Latin American countries and from Haiti, where the economy is not as well as Chile, because Chile is a developed country now, and they're coming in. They're dealing with the same issue. You know about Europe. Now again, whether it's right or wrong or different, but the point is that immigration is a historical, global issue. Our American history is one of migration and immigration. I mean, just think about it. The original inhabitants crossed over from what is present-day Russia. Everybody came from somewhere. Our shores have seen the likes of Viking explorers, Spanish conquistadores, French, British explorers and traders. 13 colonies settled by Puritans, merchants, wealth seekers, those seeking freedom of religion, freedom to pursue life and happiness. Unfortunately, we also have to acknowledge that part of that whole process involved the forced resettlement and even extermination of Native Americans and the forced immigration of African slaves. I mean, there's good and bad in all of this. Immigration exploded in the 19th and early 20th century. I mentioned this last night when Hundreds of thousands of immigrants, mostly from Catholic countries. In Europe they arrived. And it's predominantly changed the Protestant face of America. And at the same time that was going on the West Coast, we were seeing thousands of immigrants from Asia, particularly China, to come in and work on the railroads. The great immigrations of the middle and late 20th century, which we have experienced, continued to add to that Roman Catholic influence because of Latin American immigration. And then after 1965, also mentioned this last night, people arriving from Asia and Middle Eastern countries increased dramatically. So we have this great influx of Muslims and Hindus and Buddhists, which are still a statistical minority, very small minority, but I would argue that their cultural and political influence is far greater than their numbers, and that's what we're having to deal with. So what's my point? Consider that, number one, we are a nation of immigrants. We all came from somewhere else. Our national soul is an immigrant one. We all came from somewhere. Some of us just got here quicker than others. Number two, we are an American culture consisting of multiple cultures. And that's part of the fight, so to speak, that we've had for centuries. Who are we? What makes an American? We're a mosaic of cultures that are all part of the American culture. But can American culture even be specifically defined or described? I mean, is there really a typical American? You know, in the 1950s, it was Ozzie and Harriet, or your father knows best. I mean, that white middle-class person. But was that really a typical American? Well, perhaps there is a typical American, but the reality is that American culture has regional flavors, numerous racial, ethnic divisions and subdivisions. So we are a mosaic of multiple cultures. Number three, multicultural America can and should be celebrated. Now, I'm not talking about a philosophical multiculturalism that claims no absolutes. I mean, sometimes that word multicultural gets thrown out, and you got to define your terms, philosophy 101. What should be celebrated is that this nation was founded and settled by people from all over the world in all walks of life. And as we often say, you probably said it, in the present day, God continues to bring the world to us. So with our immigrant soul, our unique American multicultural reality, what does all this mean missiologically for us? Do these realities matter missiologically? Well, yeah, number one, missiologically, we must learn to see America as diverse. This means the missions task is more complicated, more difficult than many sometimes assume. I mean, you don't have the privilege, and this is especially true in urban areas, and we'll talk about urbanization in a minute. If you're, usually speaking, though it's changing now, if you were an international missionary, you got to go to one place and focus on one people group, one language, one culture. But if you're planting in Houston or Dallas or Seattle or New York or even Albuquerque, you don't have that luxury, do you? I mean, you've got to know a bunch of peoples and a bunch of worldviews. So the missions task in America is more difficult, more diverse, more complicated than most people assume. You don't just, quote, pastor a church anymore. You got to think like a missionary, and we're going to talk about that later. One missiological size and strategy does not fit all. So in this whole missiological challenge relates to that controversial homogeneous unit principle, and just mention it here because that could create all kinds of discussion. But on the one hand, our multicultural, diverse society begs for more multicultural, diverse churches, church plants, and ministries, without a doubt. We want to overcome that infamous most segregated hour of the week. But at the same time, on the other hand, if we do not see and if we do not address the multiplicity of groups, whether languages, colors, cultures, socioeconomic levels, if we don't identify them and target them or focus on them to some degree, it inevitably means that someone's going to be overlooked, going to be missed with the gospel. So I think there's a tension there. It's a homogeneous unit or not? And the answer is, again, yes. Yes. Missiologically, the challenge is to hold the tension between that homogeneous principle, often as a beginning strategy, and biblical multiculturalism and equality as the goal. And you know that. If you're planting, if you're revitalizing a church, you probably struggle with that every single day. And not just talking languages and not just talking cultures and ethnicities. The big divide in our country is socioeconomic anymore. Well, number two, missiologically, our diverse nation means that we must be ready to share the biblical narrative, the gospel story, with patience, love, and grace. In our free and pluralistic country, and this is what some folks here don't understand, and even others outside who think, well, this is a Christian country, so let's make it Christian. But we don't coerce. We don't deport for unbelief, or at least not yet. We don't gain converts just through familial, racial, ethnic, national ties. In other words, we don't just gain converts because you're born into it. It's not biological growth. Number three, missiologically, again, the nations have come to us, so that should help us fulfill the commandment to take the gospel to all nations. It's here and there. And missiologically, number four, we need to rejoice. And I think this is a change that we need to embrace and that some of our folks, especially dominant culture, are struggling with. Associations and conventions are struggling with this. We need to rejoice at the Christian influence from many immigrants. The center of gravity of world Christianity has shifted to the southern hemisphere. If you haven't read Philip Jenkins and in several of his books, you need to do that. The typical Christian today, 100 years ago, the typical Christian was a white, middle-class European male. The typical Christian today is probably African, black, a woman, poor, and probably charismatic. The future of Christianity actually will be that brand of Christianity coming out of Africa and Asia. So consequently, many immigrants coming to our shores, if they're already believers, or even if they're converted here, they're bringing with them different ways to read the Bible. That's challenging to us. They're bringing different ways to do theology. They're seeing it through different lenses, and that's challenging to us. They're bringing new and different expressions of church. Often, for those of us who are, that Anglo-Northern European background, they're bringing with them deeper understandings of Christian community and Christian transformation that is just completely new to us, that we just don't understand. A different understanding of relationships that is hard for some of us to grasp and to really understand. And they're often bringing passionate commitments to Christ that's quite unlike the typical American Christian. So we need to embrace that. We need to really embrace it. Well, that's diversity. Second change is urbanization. Rapid and continued urbanization is a critical missiological issue in our nation, but not only the nation, the world for that matter. Urbanization is a global issue, and it's creating all kinds of challenges. We were once a rural and small town nation, but now it is the city that leads our country. It is a city where most people live, where the centers of business and government and education reside, where the leading edge of art, music, entertainment, fashion, and sports is found. Now, that's not to denigrate small-town rural ministry by any means. But if you're usually in a small town or you already know about boarded-up downtowns and people moving away. It's a challenge. It's a reality, the urbanization. In 1790, 95% of the American population was rural. And that's why we did, worship service at 11. So farmers could get their stuff done before 11. It's not in the Bible. It was good contextualization in a rural context. A century later, the Industrial Revolution led to 35% urbanization. People moved to work in the factories. 1920, the number of urban dwellers for the first time passed that of the rural population. Now, 83% of Americans live in metro areas. We are becoming an urban country, and it's becoming that way around the world. That's why, for example, the IMB is shifting now to focusing on the global mega cities. We talk about a large city being 1 million people. 160 plus cities in China of 1 million and more. In some of these cities, when they talk about mega cities, they're talking 15, 20, 25, 30 million people. Okay. Suffice it to say that, number one, the American trend towards urbanization will continue. Family farms are no longer the norm. Corporate farms is growing more and more and more, and that's just killing a lot of small towns and rural churches. Jobs are scarce in rural areas, small towns, so there's a youth drain, there's a brain drain. Leave home, get the degree, and go somewhere else. Urban areas will continue to grow, particularly in the south and the west. I mean, that's where it is, that whole Sun Belt, especially due to immigration, but also to internal population shifts. Now, contrary to much of 19th and early 20th century urban immigration, immigrants are now settling directly in the suburbs where they already have family and friends. I mean, it used to be, the center cities, the core city, the inner city with the ghettos. Now people are going straight to the suburbs. They usually have better schools, affordable housing. So the suburbs now, the latest statistics say the suburbs of the large metro areas are as diverse or more diverse than central city areas. And sometimes the poverty level is greater in the suburbs than the central cities. Well, why is that? Gentrification. You try to buy something downtown. You can't afford it. Finally, Hispanics are now the largest minority group in major American cities. Furthermore, over half of America's cities are now majority non-white. And even suburbs are at least 35% non-white. We've got to take into account that diversity. So why is that of a missiological concern? Well, the majority of the population lives in urban areas, and consequently the greatest percentage of lostness is in the cities. The influence of world religions, postmodern worldviews, growing secularism only adds to the breadth and depth of that lostness, especially in urban areas. And additionally, in some cities, up to 50% or more of the population live in multi-housing settings. And the majority of multi-housing residents are in church. I've heard often that 90% of people who live in multi-housing settings do not go to church. 90%. Majority of immigrants arrive and stay in the cities and suburbs. The centers of power, business, education, entertainment, both high culture, popular culture in the cities. To reach the city is to reach the country. And the cores of the cities are being revitalized. I don't know if that's happening in Albuquerque. I'm sure it is. It's happening in most cities. And in downtown Dallas, downtown Fort Worth, downtown Houston, where I am, downtown San Antonio, I mean, there's cranes going up, there's condos, and you can't afford them. We could pool all our money, and we couldn't afford one. New people downtown. New opportunities, new business, new houses are springing up in areas that used to be run down, in disuse, defined by poverty and crime. The downside to that is that real estate prices are being driven up and the poor have to move out. And by the way, another big missiological issue is growing poverty and income inequality in the U.S. Now, there might be political differences as to what to do about it, but the statistics is that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poor. And I was in San Francisco 15 years ago went regularly on mission trips there when we had partnership with Tarrant Baptist Association. And first time I was there, we went through San Francisco. I love San Francisco. We're going around, seeing all the area. And finally I turned and I said, where do the poor people live? And he said, Oakland. Been driven out. Cannot afford to live in San Francisco. That's what's happening. So on the one hand, it's great, revitalization, all this new stuff, but it drives out the poor people. Well, another downside to gentrification in those central cities is that those central city areas are becoming less and less church friendly. In some cities, churches, and especially new church plants, you simply cannot afford property. Some American cities are passing zoning laws that discourage churches from future buildings, from purchasing land, buying buildings, from even locating in the city. Portland, Oregon is a good example of that, and it's happened elsewhere. Now, missiologically, this means that churches and church plants especially are going to have to think more and more about what? You know this, you've said it, being the church more than having a church building and facilities. We're still struggling with that. We're going to have to be the scattered church in homes, in third places, being the church simply in everyday life. Even if millions of dollars could be spent on land and buildings, the question will always have to be asked whether it was worth it. My daughter and son-in-law are in a church kind of like that in downtown Fort Worth. I love it because they're all 20-somethings. Most of them, well, I say that they're 30-somethings now, but they're millennials, they're young. But the church is what happens during the week in their small groups, and what they do. They still gather in a rented place, but they're not going to be able to buy a building in downtown Fort Worth. They can't afford it. But they're being the church more than going to church. Well, finally, the urbanization, because of growing secularism and postmodernism, the cities, as you know, are more tolerant to alternative lifestyles, particularly homosexuality and gay marriage. You know that. So there's going to be nationwide, of course, but more and more in the urban areas, there's going to be a growing intolerance towards evangelical intolerance in our hate speech when we preach Scripture. Missionaries, planters, pastors in the city must learn to experience rejection and hostility. Some of you can already give witness and testimony to that. A third change, and this applies to those of us who are older in here, but you younger folks need to be aware of this. A big demographic change is the dying of builders and the aging of boomers. If you're not sure what a builder is, that's my parents, and I'm a boomer. The builder, that greatest generation, and the silent generation right after them, those born between 1920 and 1945, they're dying off, obviously. Well, what's happening if they're church people is that commitment and giving is dying with them. At the same time, so is traditionalism, and so is identification of the church with the building. Because that generation, the church is the building. So there's good news, bad news. One thing is they're not so tied to the building. Bad news is you're losing a lot of money when they're dying. It's going away. Now boomers, which I am one, those born between 1946 and 1964, largest single generation block in American history, 76 million by 1964, almost 40% of the population. Demographic point to be made here is that this group, us boomers, us old folks, many of us, I never said it, but many of the boomers in the 1960s said you should never trust anyone over 30. Yeah, how many of you old folks remember that? Yeah, a few of you. Don't trust anyone over 30. Well, now we're turning 65. And we don't trust anybody under 30 now. But, we're retiring. We're changing the landscape of America. So boomers now number 72 million. The graying of America. That has political, economic, and vast cultural implications. For instance, baby boomers are going to redefine what it means to age, and that's already happening. My grandfather generation, retirement age was 65 because at one time they figured out in the companies you could retire, we have to give you a little pension, a golden watch, and you're going to die in a year or two. That's why retirement age is 65. Well, now how long are we living? My dad's getting ready to turn 86, and that's why they had to keep raising it. Well, not happening anymore. And boomers especially are saying, retire? I may retire, but I'm not quitting. I'm going to start a business. I'm going to do something else. We're not quitting. We got things to do. I'm 61 years old, and I'm thinking next 20 years. I'm not thinking about, well, okay, I can draw retirement in 64, 65, whatever. No, I'm thinking the next 20 years. So it's changing what it means to age because we're staying healthy and we're living longer. At the same time, however, because such a large group will be aging, America's going to be facing, and you've read about this, that economic time bomb. But because the nature of aging is changing, how aging in general is viewed by American society is going to change also. In other words, us old folks are going to force you to change how you view old folks. And it's one of the biggest mission fields available to you. Aging boomers are both a mission field, but also potential mission force. So the encouragement, and this is the old guy speaking, but the encouragement for those of you who are planting and pastoring, you've got not only a tremendous mission field, but you've got a mission force. You've got boomers who are retiring, someone with a lot of money and a lot of time and health and energy, and they're saying, hey, I don't want to go watch, the leaves turn. I don't want to just kind of go and look at the flowers at the flower festival. I want to make a difference. Some of you are already seeing that and experiencing that. It's happening. In other words, senior citizen ministry is going to change completely. Well, fourth thing here, and I'm going to talk here a little bit about American idolatry. You know, there are several, and I'm not American Idols, and I'm not talking about competing the show, but there are several American idols which we are enslaved to, which I think are missiologically significant. Now, and these are not uniquely American, and there are many more. But the reason I think these, so I'm going to mention these idols, the reason I think that they're significant is because they, number one, dominate our society in activity and in conversation. They fill the airwaves. They drive and reflect much of our economy. They dominate our public and private conversations. And number two, the postmodern fallout means that there are fewer and fewer grounds from the point of view of those who practice this idolatry by which we can critique them. In other words, relativism is the default position. So, for us to say that's wrong, who are you to say it is? Well, the Bible says, well, who are you to say it? So there's this idolatry, and we don't have any, we have grounds, but from their point of view, we have no grounds by which to critique them. Well, third reason is they're right in your church. They're in the pew. As a matter of fact, some of us buy into some of it a little bit. What do I mean? Well, I think one American idol is the right to have rights. Radical individualism. Now think about it. Now, on the one hand, the freedom we Americans live, fight, and die for is primarily expressed through individual rights. That's what we're about. Now, however we may see those individual rights play out in daily life, we hold them dearly. But what happens when individual rights, when my rights become the criteria by which we judge all concepts of freedom, all concepts of happiness? Individual rights then become radical individualism. Now, the consequences, the societal consequences, the moral consequences are many. A few include, one is we wind up with a society where every real or perceived slight is grounds for a lawsuit. I mean, people sue over everything. And why? Because of my rights have been violated. And we'll sue each other in the church. Christians will sue Christians, and Paul had something pretty clear to say about that. And another issue is that we've wound up with a society where no-fault divorce is the norm. If my rights are not met in this marriage, or if this marriage is not making me happy, then I have a right to get out of it and be happy. And even Christians fall into this trap. You've heard it. I've heard it. I used to be in biblical counseling ministry 25, 30 years ago. And I can't tell you how many times. Well, God wouldn't want me to be unhappy. I have a right to be happy. And all morality and biblical ethics aside, it all boils down to what? My rights. We have a society, number three, where the right to choose and women's reproductive rights automatically overrule the right to life. You know that. We have a society that is willing to redefine traditional understandings of sexuality and gender identity and marriage based upon what? The right to exercise one's sexuality. Now, the issues of gay marriage and homosexuality and gender issues, obviously they're much broader and much more complex than just demanding one's rights. I understand that. But have you ever noticed that at some point in the argument, when it gets heated, at some point it kind of boils down to, but I have a right. It's the rights. Never mind morality, never mind ethics, never mind an overarching biblical worldview or just a natural law worldview. It all boils down to, I have a right. What could be more American than appealing to one's rights? But for many, that's the crux of the argument. It's not morality, it's not biblical authority, it's not the opinion of the majority that matters, it's individual rights. So that's become an idol. And number two is, you've preached on this, materialism. We're an immigrant nation. And many people who came here left poverty to do what? To have a better life. That's the American way. Upward mobility is weaved into our worldview as much as individual rights. In fact, that's the American dream. Working hard to improve one's life is a good thing. Working hard to make life better and easier for future generations is a good thing. But working hard to improve one's material status becomes an idol. However, when, number one, it erodes marriage, family, and other relationships. Now, again, I'm not telling you anything you don't know. But this is, we've bought into this. It leads to unethical practices. You know, that deacon businessman who cheats on his taxes, doesn't do, you know, he justifies it. You know that. It becomes an end rather than a means. It deteriorates into consumerism. Consumerism is just basically the American dream gone wild, the American dream on steroids. We buy what we don't need with money we don't have because somebody else told us we need it. How often, I've done it, you know, I've said it. How often have you gone into whether it's the Walmart on one end or the big, you know, Neiman Marcus on the other end, or the sporting good, whatever, you walk in and I didn't know I needed all this stuff till I came in here. You know, have you ever thought that? You know, and we get caught up in all the stuff and we begin to buy into the materialism, into the consumerism, and the churches have bought into that. You know that. Bigger is better, more is better, and we fall into this whole competition stuff, and we'll talk a little bit about how this competition between churches is not working anymore. A third idol, science and technology. Now, how are we idolizing science and technology? Well, there's a little bit of change here between the modern worldview and the postmodern worldview, but one, we still believe, the average American to some degree still believes science is going to get us out of the mess we've created. If we can put a man on the moon, then we ought to be able, with the right minds, the right amount of money, the right time, we ought to be able, we can cure cancer, stop global warming, stop aging, and eliminate every inconvenience of life. Now, none of that's a bad thing. But we begin to idolize what science and technology can do. Certainly, science should be used for those things. It is God's gift to us. But are we expecting it to do things that cannot and sometimes should not be done? Where do we ultimately place our faith? Well, second thing is we look to technology, and this is perhaps the more obvious one. We look to technology to fill the meaninglessness, the hopelessness, the unhappiness in our lives. As everybody looks at their phone real quick. No. As we look for a cure to our boredom, we often look at technology, movies, television, music, video games, motorcycles, motorboats, gadgets, toys. They all may be pleasant. They all may be healthy ways to find rest and recreation. But when these, combined with materialism, they seek to produce and sell and convince us that we must have all of these to be happy, then we have an idol on our hands. And closely related to that, number 4 is entertainment. Now, rest, recreation, having fun is not wrong. I know I'm starting to sound like a stick in the mud, but I'm going to clarify some of this. It's not wrong. As a matter of fact, it's mandated by God that we rest and recreate and have fun. When they threw a party in the Old Testament and the New Testament, they threw a week-long, sometimes weeks-long party. They knew how to do it. It was practiced by the people of Israel, by Jesus, by his disciples. They rested, they recreated, they had fun. Our difficulty is we just don't really know how to do that. We don't know how to really rest and really recreate. We fill our time with countless and extremely expensive activities so we could be distracted and titillated and stimulated. Sometimes some of these activities lead to rest. Sometimes they're just simply activities of a different kind used for distraction. Well, the billions of dollars and millions of hours spent on sports, music, movies, eating out, concerts, video games, gadgets, that's a cultural obsession. It's an obsession that just begs for more and more. We got more sports leagues than ever, but it's not enough, so we create fantasy ones. Amusement parks generate $12 billion in revenues each year. Cable television, this is already 10-year-old. In 2007, $75 billion in television revenues. Movies, more than $10 billion in movies in 2009. Now, I'm a big movie fan. My wife and I, we love movies. So again, I'm not saying this. I'm not saying, I'm a Gandhi. I do none of this. No, but I'm just saying it can become an obsession. In 2006, 10 years ago, so you could probably double or triple this, $13 billion on home video and computer games. Now, I won't even get into our gambling obsession. I mean, that's just exploded. Gambling, casinos, lotteries, attacks on the poor, basically, without them even knowing it. And again, I'm not being a stick in the mud. I've got 2,700 songs on my iPod. I love movies. But, we got to be careful. Yeah, don't laugh. Yeah. Number 5, free love at last. What about our obsession with sex? Obviously, among all of God's good gifts to humans, perhaps none has been as misused, abused, perverted as that of sex. And you know all the statistics. And if those statistics are true, many in this very room struggle deeply with sexual temptation, if not outright sin. Even if you're exceptional, this is an exceptional group, but there's still a percentage in here that struggle with that on a regular basis. The bottom line is that America has made an idol out of sex. Yeah, we've kind of gone through 3 general attitudes in our history towards sex. One, there was that era, which, many look back to, wish we had it. There was that era when sex was a taboo subject. It was practiced in private. And even sinful acts were kept private. Now, it didn't mean people didn't sin. They sinned just as much then as they do now. They just kept it quiet. You study a little history. The illegitimate childbirth, all that kind of stuff. It's always been there. Number 2, and this, of course, started in the 60s and 70s, there was that era of open and free love, in which sex has been freed from its shackles, and it became an idol. Well, right now, number 3 is I think we're going to a rapidly developing era in which sex has become so open, so commonplace, so routine, so marketable, that it really carries no more meaning for many people than having lunch together. And it's an attitude already common in pop culture. It's an attitude that we find in some European countries. I mean, it's just, hey, whatever. You know that. Just hook up. Just whatever. Have lunch or have sex. What's the difference? We're enslaved to it completely. Well, some missiological implications. Let me finish this up. How do we remove idols from our life? Number 1, rapidly, we must unmask the idols by naming them. We've got to call them by name. But this includes and implies confrontation through word and deed. Now, I'm not talking about standing on the street corner and preaching and yelling, but we do preach that idolatry is anything that it interferes with, distracts from, takes the place of our faith in and dependence on God. More difficultly and more importantly, it's for us to practice what we preach. Now, practically, it may mean that we simplify our lives materially, we reduce our own obsession, maybe even participation in all those accepted diversions. And again, this is not a call for the old days when, there were all those worldly diversions. You didn't play cards and you didn't play pool, and you didn't do anything like that, and you didn't go with girls who did. And I'm not going back to that legalism. I'm not saying that. But we do need to have an honest evaluation of our priorities and investment of time and resources. We must be willing to give up our own rights. Now, we appreciate American political, economic, social freedom. We appreciate individual rights that come for that. We must stand up for justice and for the rights of those who cannot defend themselves and cannot speak for themselves. But at the same time, we can demonstrate what it means to be a slave to Christ by giving up our rights for the sake of others. We don't always have to be right. We don't always have to win. We don't always have to be compensated for a loss. Even as Paul said, sometimes you just need to lose. It's better just to lose and let love cover all of that. We need to articulate, practice a comprehensive biblical theology of life. I mean, not just life begins at conception, but now you got to deal with those biomedical ethics, end-of-life issues. And that's part of that whole science and technology stuff, is just because we can do it, should we do it? Boy, some of that stuff is really, really tough to deal with. We must practice simpler lifestyles, demonstrate generosity. I've often thought, and I'm not here by any means, but I've often thought, what would be one of the most countercultural things we as believers, as churches, could do today? I mean, what would get people's attention today? How about if we gave away 50% of what we had? What about if we lived on 50% and gave the rest away? What about if churches not just CP, but what if churches gave away 50% of what? I'm not saying anybody's there. I'm just saying, would that not be countercultural? We got to keep science and technology in perspective. We make full use of it. We need Christians to get into science and technology, but we need to be fully aware that they're human constructions. They're temporary. They will fail us. We must learn and practice what the Bible means by Sabbath rest. We must practice sexual purity. And this is perhaps the most difficult thing, because nothing attracts attention more and causes more problems for us than when a Christian leader falls. We got to practice what we preach. And we're about out of time here, but the other thing, and I mentioned this last night, big changes, those worldview shifts, from the modern to the postmodern, from absolute truth and a truth that can be revealed or discovered to, nope, there is no truth, construct your own. We got to deal with that. But the conclusion, the missiological conclusion, is change is happening. It's happening faster, more chaotically than ever. And if we're going to be fruitful, we're going to have to learn more and more to think and act like a missionary. And we'll talk more about that in session 3. And I got some questions for further reflection up there. I'll let you look at those, but basically, I just got to look at my own culture, my own worldview. Am I aware of who I am, what I think, what are my presuppositions, what are my biases, what's my community, and how is that all going to affect my ministry and my mission? Thank you very much. Appreciate your time.